China had built its economy on low labor costs. This model, which was built on low labor costs, was very successful. Now, real wages in the Chinese economy are not as low as they were in the past. So, have new countries emerged with real wages as low as China? Will these countries be able to compete with China in being the producers of the world? So who are these new producing countries? Countries such as Vietnam, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, some of which are next to China. Some of them are in different geographies such as Mexico, Turkey, Egypt. Even within the European Union, it is possible to talk about the existence of new producer countries in Poland. This aforementioned trend has been drawing attention in the world production markets as a bottom wave for several decades. But the arrival of Trump in 2016 crystallized and accelerated the process. The economic war that Trump launched against China has changed the world economy. And the Biden government, which came after Trump, also implements Trump policies on China. America wants new giant manufacturing hubs to emerge outside of China. Anti-American forces, on the other hand, are trying to influence the new production-based countries. This new challenge, perhaps, will unfold even more fiercely on a continent that we never expected. This continent is Africa with its vast lands and natural resources. As China begins to reopen its factories and return back to work, what they are returning to will not be the same. Despite China being the world's economic darling for the last 40 years, the balance of the world's economic power has begun to shift to some places that you might not expect. In fact, we are already starting to see some signs of other nations around the world rising up in order to take away some of China's manufacturing prowess away from them. And who knows, we might be witnessing the creation of the next generation of economic superpowers, right in front of our very eyes. But the reason that this is happening is a little complex. It started a few decades ago in 1970s China when the country began shifting its economic policy away from communism, and more towards capitalism. They soon began building specific economic zones where massive ports and factories could be built that would maximize productivity and efficiency. And once these economic zones were opened up to foreign trade and investment, China's economy began exploding. In the 1980s, many Fortune 500 companies began having their products manufactured in China because China could make their products with a similar quality, but for a substantially lower price than if they were manufactured in the West. And this was because of the extremely low wages that Chinese workers made, combined with other factors like tax laws and import/export efficiencies. So all of a sudden, if a competitor chose to manufacture their products outside of China, they simply could not compete on price, which would likely have made them go out of business. And because of this, by the 2010s, 1/3 of all products on the planet were manufactured in China. Within the span of 50 years, China has turned itself around from an impoverished nation of farmers, to a nation that has the second largest economy in the world, behind the United States. But a few strange things began happening in the past few years. Here's a question: what happens when a country who builds its economy based upon low labor costs, all of a sudden becomes successful and wealthy? In 1990, the average yearly wage from a Chinese worker was about $150. By 2005, it was $2,800. In 2015, it was $8,900. As of this year, the average Chinese worker will make around $13,500. That is a massive increase that has seen the average wage of a manufacturing worker increase by over 8,500% over the last 30 years. And what this means is that the cost of making products in China has become a lot more expensive than it used to be. Companies can't make products for an 80% discount in China, like they used to. And because of this, we actually began to see a decline in manufacturing in China in 2016, where for the first time in the country's modern history, their manufacturing output actually decreased by 2% during that year. But that was just the first factor coming into play. After 2016, China once again saw modest increases in manufacturing output, until the United States imposed tariffs on imports from China. This caused a decrease in Chinese imports to the US by 7% in 2019, and forced many companies to begin looking for product sourcing in other countries. And if that wasn't enough, privacy concerns and tensions between China and the Western world have been on the rise ever since the country began taking over part of the world's tech sector. Ever since then, governments around the world have been actively trying to push Chinese technology out of their countries, while also incentivizing businesses to make their products domestically instead of China. In fact, just last week, the Departments of Justice in the United States have requested that the FCC terminate China's telecom authorization in the United States, citing it as a national security risk. And all of these things, from rising labor costs to geopolitical issues, have led us to today and the pandemic. You see, even though China-sourced manufacturing has been slowing down over the past decade, the country still remains the largest manufacturer in the world. So once the pandemic rose out of Wuhan and caused a shutdown of China's manufacturing sector, many countries began to run out of essential goods that they needed simply because they relied upon China to produce them and had no backup plans. So for example, China is the leading manufacturer of medical equipment in the world. So when the world needed an increase in the supply of masks, ventilators and gloves etc., no longer get them from their relied upon manufacturer from China. China is also the second largest producer of drugs and medicinal ingredients in the world. So when the pandemic hit, roughly 100 commonly used drugs were reported to be in a shortage by the FDA. And these shortages didn't just hit the medical sector, but they hit virtually every other industry. All of a sudden, small businesses to whom looking to get inventory for tech requirement, or any other kind of business, they began to see 1 to 2 month long delays on their orders. And this seemed to be the final straw for most of the world to change their manufacturing strategy. You see, many companies in the last several months have realized that they had too many eggs in one basket and relied too heavily upon one nation in order for their business to run properly. So we have started to see a shift. Last week, Japan announced a $2.2 billion incentive plan to move their manufacturing base out of China, and while also diversifying into towards other Asian countries. And a recent report from Tokyo found that roughly 37% of more than 2,600 companies surveyed said that they were planning to move at least part of their manufacturing to a country outside of China. Now that brings up the next question: as China's manufacturing sector beacons to shrink in every other nation around the world begins to look to other countries to source their goods from, who will be the biggest beneficiaries of this shift out of China? Well, the first of which is another Asian country that has been quietly going through an economic boom over the last several decades. In the year 2000, Vietnam was a country that was experiencing extreme poverty throughout its population of nearly 100 million people. In fact, the GDP per capita of Vietnam was a paltry $390 at the time. Then they were dealt a gift from the economic gods as China's population began to become somewhat wealthy in the 2000s. Apparel companies like Nike began building factories in Vietnam because it became substantially cheaper to manufacture some products in Vietnam as opposed to China. And in the following decades, many other companies began to do the same as China's wealth began to accelerate into the 2010s. Vietnam's manufacturing sector began to accelerate as well. Today, Vietnam is now considered a middle-income country with a GDP per capita of roughly $3,000. And keep in mind that this shift from extreme poverty to middle income has occurred within just 20 years, making it one of the fastest-growing economies in history. And if this trend were to continue, we could see a Vietnam surpassed the likes of the United Arab Emirates, Singapore, Iran, and even Hong Kong in terms of economic power within the next several decades. Another country that has benefited a lot from China's manufacturing downturn, especially over the last 2 years, has been Mexico. Tempest Capital has estimated that Mexico will be receiving between $12 billion and $19 billion in Chinese manufacturing redirects per year for the near future. And in fact, one survey of 160 executives by Fully suggested that 2/3 of large corporations in the United States were planning on moving at least part of their manufacturing base out of China and into Mexico within 2 years. Now, who knows how many of these companies will actually follow through with their plans, but there's a lot of data that is showing how Mexico is already becoming a bigger manufacturing hub of the world. For example, in 2017, Mexico's exports to the United States have increased by roughly 14% to a whopping $320 billion. And just in perspective, that is about 42% of what China exports to the United States. So they're still a long way off, but gaining ground year after year. However, India is one of the most interesting countries that has benefited in recent years as world production has started to move beyond China. India has about the same population as China with 1.3 billion people. But the difference is that India is still largely an agricultural society with a much poorer infrastructure. Roughly half of the workforce in India still works in some way in the agricultural sector. And just for comparison, roughly 5% of the American population works in agriculture. Regardless, since 2002, India's economy has grown from a GDP per capita of $470 to roughly $2,100 in 2020. And this economic growth has resulted in India lifting more than 300 million of its citizens out of poverty over the last 8 years. But here's the thing, unlike a country such as Vietnam, India's growth has not come from manufacturing, that has actually come from service-based industries like banking, retail, and information technology. Except there was one economic experiment that began being run at the start of 2014, and that was cell phone manufacturing. So at the start of 2014, India was manufacturing about 10 million cell phones a year. But by the end of 2019, India was producing roughly 150 million cell phones per year and quickly became the second largest cell phone manufacturer in the world. And despite this massive ramp-up in manufacturing of cell phones, India's infrastructure is still seen as too inadequate right now for them to become the next China. But with big investments from companies like Apple, who have begun making some of their iPhones in cities like Chennai, we might see an expansion of India's manufacturing sector in the near future. And one key advantage that India has is a large young workforce and an extremely low cost of labor currently in India. The average manufacturing laborer makes about $5 per day, meanwhile the average Chinese manufacturing labor makes about $28 per day. This has made India a more attractive place for some companies to take a risk and manufacture their products in India, even if they run into some infrastructure problems along the way. So if India were to fix their infrastructure and capitalize on manufacturing in the same way that China did in the 1990s, we might see India become the third true economic superpower of the world behind the United States and China. That does not mean that China will be giving up its mantle for being the world's factory anytime soon. It looks like we might be at least 20 years away before another country catches up to the likes of China in terms of manufacturing output. But this brings up a question. If the Vietnam, Mexico, or India become the new China and reach a wealth standard that China reached in the 2010s, then what will the next manufacturing hub be? Well, some say that within 50 years, with enough advancements in artificial intelligence and robotics, many products will be produced domestically by each country. But if that doesn't happen within the next half-century, there is an entire continent with a large population and cheap labor force that is already being viewed as an economic battleground between the United States and China. Africa, but we will tell the story of the economy of Africa for another time. So I'd like to ask to you friends, what do you think is going to happen to the manufacturing sector around the world in the coming years? Do you think China will have a downturn? And who do you think will become the next manufacturing superpower of the world? Friends, what do you think about the economic system in the world and the international production system? Please write in the comments. If you like the video, you can find similar videos on my channel. You can tap the subscribe and like buttons. If you like the video, click on my next video and we'll see you again in a few seconds. Thanks, my friends.